The idea of jails has a long history, and the historical roots of American jails are from England. Sheriffs operated these early jails, and their primary purpose was to hold accused persons awaiting trial. This English model was brought over to the colonies, but the function remained the same. In the 1800s, jails began to change in response to the penitentiary movement. Their function was extended to housing those convicted of minor offenses and sentenced to shorter terms of incarceration. They were also used for other purposes, such as holding the mentally ill and vagrants. The advent of a separate juvenile justice system and the development of state hospitals alleviated the burden of taking care of the later categories, the juveniles and the mentally ill. Today's jails are critical components of local criminal justice systems. They are used to address the need for secure detention at various points in the criminal justice process. Jails typically serve several law enforcement agencies in the community, including local law enforcement, state police, wild conservation officers, and federal authorities. Jails respond to many needs in the criminal justice system and play an integral role within every tier of American criminal justice. These needs are ever-changing and influenced by the policy, practices, and philosophies of the many different users of the jail. Running a jail is tough business, usually undertaken by a county sheriff, who often much of the sheriff's authority is delegated to a jail administrator. Running a jail is a complicated endeavor, partly because jails serve an extremely diverse population. Unlike prisons, where inmate populations are somewhat the same, homogenous, jails hold vastly different individuals. Jails hold both men and women, and both children and adults. Most state prisoners are serious offenders, whereas jails, they hold both serious offenders as well as minor offenders who may be vulnerable to the predatory criminals. Those suffering from mental illness, alcoholism, and drug addiction often find themselves in jail. There are 5 primary purposes of jails: to detain accused offenders, hold convicted offenders awaiting sentence, confine offenders convicted of misdemeanors, hold probationers and parolees arrested for violations and they're awaiting their hearing, and it houses felons when state prisons are overcrowded. And I am going to note they also hold some federal prisoners who might be in the midst of being transported. So let's talk about the population in jails. There are approximately 3,300 jails nationwide. In 2009, the jail population began to decline, and in 2015, around 728,000 inmates were housed in jails nationwide. I suspect that's much lower now. We don't have an updated figure, but even based on New York, when New York went through its bail reform last year, a lot of inmates who were being held, those being accused of a crime, were released, and the bail rules have significantly lifted and made it easier for individuals to be released. So the jails of New York had cleared out pretty quickly at the beginning of 2020 when those laws went into effect. And I'd imagine other states who took similar actions, that has occurred. So I'd imagine that's even lower. So who goes to jail? As I indicated, there are a wide variety of individuals housed in jails, but the statistics show that the population is made up of primarily adult males, although the female population is increasing. The minorities unfortunately make up a disproportionate number of those individuals housed in jails. Of course, we've already discussed this link, the link that could result of the race-based disparity is the sentencing practices. As we've recently learned, African Americans are more likely to receive a jail sentence than whites, also a harsher sentence than Caucasians, as well as racial differences in the economy. If they can't make bail, The inability to make bail creates overpopulation of jails. People are sitting there waiting for their cases to happen. Some people sit there for painfully a long time because they can't make bail. And I know we've talked about the bail issues in the last section when we talked about courts. What about the conditions? What are the conditions of a jail? Well, jail funding is not necessarily a priority, but really it depends on the county. Some facilities are state of the art. I believe for the North Country, the Essex County Jail is pretty state of the art. I've been inside there, but then there's some that are pretty bare bones. Clinton County, St. Lawrence County jails, they're efficient, and they're starting to get some more resources, but funding's not a priority. And there's also no national unified policy setting any sort of standards for what is deemed adequate conditions for a jail. So unfortunately, we have dangerous and violent offenders are housed with juveniles and non-violent offenders. Also, many inmates suffer from untreated emotional problems, as there are generally no services in jails because it's referred to as a warehouse. Judges will refer to jails as warehouses. That's where people are housed. Unfortunately and sadly, suicide, inmates commit suicide at a higher rate than the general population, the inmates of jails. However, and thankfully, that a number of jail suicides have dramatically decreased in the last 20 years. Why is that? The issue has been recognized. It's been recognized as significant, and efforts to provide services for those who have been identified as suffering from psychological or substance abuse problems or have a history of past suicide attempts are being treated and seen and cared for. Also, there's the development of new generation jails that has helped decrease the risk of suicide. So let's talk about these new generation jails. They're there to help with overcrowding. These new jails are being created. Generally, they are jails. These new generation jails are clusters, allowing for continuous supervision. And there are two types. There's a direct supervision jail, which contains a group of cells surrounding a living area or a pod. They can refer to it as a pod. So they have this central common area, which has tables, chairs, TVs, some other materials, and the cells kind of stem off from this living area. And there's an officer stationed within the pod, so there's always direct, constant supervision. The indirect supervision is the same exact description I just gave you, except the officer is secured in a room inside the pod and runs everything, doors and as such, inside the control room rather than being seated right in there amongst the inmates. These systems allow for officers to supervise inmates at all times, continuously, and usually as a group. The traditional jails, they were constructed in a way that officers would have to patrol corridors, viewing one cell at a time. So in essence, leaving other inmates out of sight. They just would go one by one, and they would only be able to see one inmate at a time. So that's our overview of the jails. And now the second correctional facility that we're going to talk about is the prison.